Hello and welcome to Because Miami. We've got a lot of different things that I'm interested in today. Michael Grunwald, who I believe to be almost a foremost expert on the history of Florida, will be explaining to us how weird a state this is and why Florida is so much different when it comes to voting than the rest of the United States. He's going to join us in about 10 minutes. And Adam Goodman, a criminal defense attorney, is going to explain yet the latest thing with voting that doesn't feel very fair or democratic later in the show as well. We've got election results to get to with Billy Corbin. I'm sure he wants to make fun of FTX and the Miami Heat's basketball arena. We'll get to that in a second as well. But first, God forbid, your documentary that is doing very well on Hulu and elsewhere is screening at FIU when?
Yeah, the Wilsonian Public Humanities Lab is doing a big screening of it on November 15th, which is next Tuesday at 6 p.m. At the main campus, in Westchester. The SACS building, room 160, big, beautiful, newish building on campus. And it's kind of cool because they're doing a panel with some professors in religion and humanities. So it's actually going to be a pretty cool academic kind of conversation and look at our documentary that is subtitled "The Sex Scandal That Brought Down a Dynasty." But I'm excited that people are taking it seriously and are looking at it as something that's worth talking about in a forum like this.
A lot of people are talking about, God forbid, the aforementioned documentary. A couple of days after that, we want to let the people know, if you're interested during this holiday season in doing some good, in doing some giving, Give Miami Day is a couple of days right after that.
Yes, November 17th, 2022. Go to givemiamiday.org. This is an annual virtual event, happens all online, 24 straight hours where you can it's a clearinghouse where you can find all of the amazing nonprofit organizations doing extraordinary work across like every sector, whether it's the arts or education or homelessness or you name it. And
very little corruption there. A pristine place that is almost devoid of corruption, we can say, correct? I mean, it is Miami. It is Miami.
Some of these nonprofits, Dan, but most of them are fantastic. Please go to givemiamiday.org on Thursday, November 17th, and help support some of these extraordinary organizations who are, yes, Dan, by and large, trying to do good work here in our community.
What would you tell people about this latest frenetic week were the most interesting takeaways from the midterms?
Well, in a midterm election with 8% inflation, no less, all history and conventional wisdom, and certainly all the media was saying that this was going to be and should have been arguably a red wave. There should have been, if not a rout, a lot of easy victories and pickups for the Republicans. And it turned out to not be true. This was an unpredictable year with more important issues at stake than inflation and gas prices. And a lot of young people and women went out and voted for issues that the polling was saying nobody cared about. As it turns out, Gen Zers don't pick up their cell phones for unknown numbers and answer questions from pollsters. So the polls were dead wrong about a lot of this. Florida, however, remains immune to logic, decency, and progress. It was the major outlier. It was the only home of a calculable red wave. And it makes Florida an outlier. I would argue that it is still a bellwether. It's still a canary in the coal mine. And if you want to know what challenges will face us as a nation to come, or calamities will befall us in the years or even decades to come, you need only to look at Florida and South Florida, where Miami-Dade, I think, not to anybody's surprise here, quote unquote, went red. Again, that was not particularly surprising to me. Was it surprising to you, Dan?
I was surprised at how much different Florida was than the rest of the country. I was surprised that Democratic turnout was better everywhere than it was here. But we will talk to Michael Grunwald, again, an authority on the history of Florida, in a few minutes about the history of Florida and how it is that we got to this particular weirdness.
Michael Grunwald, in his latest article this week in The Atlantic, a kind of postmortem, an autopsy on the Florida Democratic Party, if you will, says, quote, in Florida, the party also has an attitude problem, an organizational problem, a Latino problem, a growth problem, and a broccoli problem. We'll talk about most of those with him in a little bit. But a lot of people that I've talked to, Dan, through early voting, vote by mail, and then midterm election day, they seem to not know what they were voting for, but they really knew what they were voting against. And what was distressing about that is what they were voting against, a lot of it was science fiction, was boogeymen.
Misinformation.
Was nonsense. I mean, and things they can't even, like, if you ask a follow-up, okay, well, what do you mean by woke? What do you mean by communism? What do you mean by socialism? What do you mean by CRT? What do you mean, by, like, what do you mean by they can't really answer the question. So again, they certainly didn't vote to lower gas prices. They certainly didn't vote to lower, inflation. They certainly didn't vote to lower the rent. They certainly didn't vote for better public schools or health care or any of the things that affect their lives on a daily basis. But they knew what they were voting against, and they were voting against caca. They were voting against made up stuff that seemed to really mean a lot to them, despite the fact that they could not describe it, define it, or quantify it. It's a fascinating phenomenon. It doesn't bode well for the future of the country.
You're always saying that Miami and Florida are 20 years ahead. One of your documentaries is about the year 2000, the voting that year between Al Gore and George Bush that was decided in Florida and predicted what we're presently seeing now in dirty politics.
Yeah. Voto castigo, the revenge vote, and the idea that's the thing too, the idea that people would go out and vote not necessarily to improve their own lives, but to go out and punish other people, perhaps even including themselves, because they may or may not be voting in their own best interest. That's incredibly damaging. And Michael Grunwald, in his article in The Atlantic this week, talks about how the Democrats have become such a losing brand and a losing team here. And I think this speaks to the sportsification and, even worse, the WWEification of politics, which is to say, like, I don't care if my team cheats or deflates the ball. My team won. But what did you win, and who won and who lost? And I think a society, a civilized society, and particularly one of the richest and most successful countries in the history of this planet, the United States of America, we should be measured on how it is we treat our most vulnerable people. Children, the handicapped, the elderly, immigrants, minorities, the LGBTQ plus community, people who are marginalized communities. And how is it that we in the land of the free and the home of the brave treat those people? And why should we not give more people more rights, more Americans more rights? Because that makes government smaller, and that gives the power to the people, which is supposedly consistent with conservative small government values. But that doesn't seem to be what people care about. We've been talking about that on this show for some time. They want a strong man. They want a dictator. They want someone who is going to punish their enemies. For what exactly, I'm not sure. And more frighteningly, they're not sure either. They just know their red team and they want to crush the blue team, and it doesn't matter what the consequences of that are. Even more intriguing is the conventional wisdom that Democrats want open borders and more humane immigration policies and the ability to integrate and legalize or legitimize immigrants who are already here, perhaps off the books or off the grid, but still manage to pay taxes and contribute to society. And the Democrats want that, not because it's humane, but because they want more Democratic voters. But that's bullshit, because you don't know how anybody is going to ultimately vote.
Immigrants voted against immigrants and their own health care, so
and housing and everything else. I mean, it's a fascinating phenomenon that you and I have been talking about many years before we ever did this podcast. It's part of what makes it so unique. And here's the thing that's also so interesting, is that and we've mentioned this fact on this show as well, that no matter who wins or loses, I win, because
Weird wins.
If the government, if we elect better people and we have better government, I win because we have better government. And if we elect horrible people, criminals, in fact, which we'll talk about later, I win too because it makes Miami more interesting. It raises the conflict level. It gets the rest of the country and the rest of the world going, what the hell is going on down there? Can somebody please translate and explain Florida and Miami? And then we come on this show and we do it on this show.
He's always a winner. He's the white man, Billy Corbin. We will talk with Michael Grunwald. You always win from every angle.
Man. You're the white man in Miami, anyway.
How do you think I feel over here?
Disenfranchised.
Yes, very much so.
FTX, the naming sponsor of the Miami Heat's arena, signed a 19-year deal. And this week had a calamity befall FTX. Not surprising. You've been laughing about Bitcoin and its fraudulent undercurrent for a long time around here. What did you make of this story?
It's one of these classic social media, how it started, how it's going kind of memes, right? Just a year ago in the New York Times, Miami Mayor Ponzi Postalita, Francis Suarez, was so excited about FTX, this cryptocurrency exchange, coming to the table and making a very big offer for the naming rights on the Miami Heat Arena, formerly the American Airlines Arena. Another great local business, the Bang Brothers, the pornographers, they made a bid of $10 million to get the naming rights on the Bang Brothers Arena. But FTX came in, won the bid, $135 million for, I forget how,
19 years.
19 years. And Francis Suarez said,
I don't know how you forgot. I just said it.
Francis Suarez said, quote,
I said it not but 30 seconds ago.
19 years? No, I
did.
Yeah.
You're just listening to the sound of your own voice. You are just waiting for the next time you get to talk.
I thought you were talking about how old the actresses were on Bang Brothers. But Francis Suarez said, quote, "It's awesome that we've attracted a huge cryptocurrency exchange," noting that FTX's bid would, quote, "complement the brand that Miami is establishing." I'm sorry, I had to say it again. This is from the New York Times from just last year. Francis Suarez says, "It's awesome that we've attracted a huge cryptocurrency exchange," noting that FTX's bid complements the brand that Miami is establishing, and truer words were never spoken. That's how it started, how it's going. FTX hurdles toward bankruptcy with an $8 billion hold and a U.S. federal probe. That is the headline at Bloomberg this week, along with the fact that it turns out that their rock star CEO, Sam Bankman-Fried, who has been quite a presence economically anyway here in South Florida, he is being accused of possibly misusing consumer funds from one company, possibly shifting them into this other company. As it stands, FTX doesn't they operate in the U.S., but they're not based in the U.S. First, they were based in Hong Kong, now in the Bahamas, because the types of trades that they transact are not actually legal here in the United States. He had been working, though, and lobbying in D.C. to actually basically legalize this illegal operation because Miami. And just this past weekend, a guy known as Changpeng Zhao, known as CZ, who is the number one richest crypto bro. This Sam Bankman-Fried of FTX was the second richest crypto bro, a multi-billionaire. Well, he was a multi-billionaire, not anymore this week, but a multi-billionaire, by age 30. And they've been going back and forth with a war of words. And what happened was CZ actually said, "Oh, there are cracks in the armor over here. I'm going to sell off all my shares in their coin because there's a problem at FTX." And then it caused a run on the bank. And I think on Sunday alone, this past Sunday, there was like a $5 billion worth of withdrawals. And then by the middle of the week, there were no withdrawals. It was shut down, and everybody started panicking.
Yeah, they weren't allowed. The withdrawals weren't allowed anymore
because there's no liquidity. They have run out of money, and in fact, they need $4 billion apparently just to remain solvent, because that hole is about allegedly twice that amount of money. And so Miami-Dade County, who owns the Miami Heat Arena, who got that contract for $135 million for how many years?
19 years.
19 years. They They said, we are going to take every legal remedy that we can to ensure that they fulfill that contract. There's no money, man. This whole house of cards. And FTX collapsing, by the way, this is like one of the most the second most popular crypto exchange in the entire world. This is not like a little blip on the radar screen. This is, to use a metaphor, this is like Lehman Brothers, like closing during, crashing and burning during the Great Recession.
Without a government to come in and help.
Exactly. So this is the crypto winter version of Lehman Brothers collapse. The difference being no government is going to come in and bail out some company and their unregistered illegal securities, a peddling operation. And this whole thing has been a house of cards. And the idea that the mayor of this city would be out there pumping and dumping this shit, going out there and saying, bro, you need to buy as much Mary Kay as possible to help Miami. It was never to help Miami. This was never going to help Miami. This was to help him and his clients.
Billy?
I'm sorry. I saw you making eyes at...
Well, because we've got sound to play.
Oh.
Morons and idiots running the city of Miami.
I'm all for that. Find more clips from Billy's movie. Which Cocaine Cowboys was that from?
That was from Numero Uno.
The first one.
The OG.
That was not The Godmother.
No, it's not hustling with no G, an apostrophe, Dan. Hustling with The Godmother. I was young and I needed the money.
Michael Grunwald, I'm telling you, he's a foremost authority on the history of Florida. He will be next telling us why it is that Florida is so fucked up. Happy to talk to this guy. Want to talk to him long form about really a masterpiece of a work, The Swamp, that he wrote about the history of Florida, that taught me so much. I thought I knew things about the state, and I didn't know anything until reading what he wrote about the Swamp, the Everglades, Florida, and the politics of paradise. And I wanted to have him on. He's the co-host of the Climavores podcast about food and climate change. It is essentially around a book he's writing for Simon & Schuster about how to feed the world without frying the world. But what I wanted to talk to him about today with Billy is just what's happening in Florida and how weird Florida is. And I don't even know where to start. Climate change, limiting water consumption, building your house in a safe location. These things are luring people to Florida. DeSantis's vision of the free state of Florida is no one forces you to do anything, to pay income taxes, to get vaccinated. And it's freedom that he's arguing on behalf of. And it's weird to me how different Florida is from the rest of the country, Billy. But
it's also a mirage. It's a little bit of a fantasy, obviously, because there are extraordinary limitations on all of the on his whole MLM pitch. Like the whole thing feels like a Ponzi scheme, relying solely on these new investors and this new money and these new people.
It's not new though either. Like, as someone, Michael has written about the history of Florida, we've been this since the beginning.
Well, the headline is Florida isn't the swing state it once was. Grunwald's latest for The Atlantic, published this week, to explain this is a postmortem. This is an autopsy is what this is. Michael and I, we're like friends who only get together at funerals or only see each other at Shivas or whatever. But and our people try to laugh through it, Dan. You laugh through the pain. You celebrate the life and tell funny stories about things that have died, like, Florida and democracy. But I've been saying that Florida is not a swing state for a decade, that it's not a purple state. It's a red state with occasional glimpses of hope and promise. But Florida is not. I mean, for 22 years, the Republicans have held on to this state. And for people to say that we're voting to make things better and for change and improvement, you've just voted for the status quo that has sort of put us in exactly the situation that we're in. Michael, what was your take the morning after, if you will, when we had a red wave that failed to materialize, that was the conventional wisdom all over the country, and really only materialized here in Florida, who appeared to be by and large the outlier?
Well, it's like we went to bed in a swing state and woke up in South Alabama. It's it's look, I mean, I mentioned in the piece that this really was an unbelievably politically divided state. I mean, it became a cliche to say it was like a perennial swing state, but I mean, come on, like we had 50 million votes for president over 7 presidential elections, and they were divided by 0.04% between the parties. Yeah. I mean, this really was divided. I mean, Rick Scott won 3 elections here, all less than 1%. And remember what happened in 2018, where DeSantis won, by 0.4%, and Rick Scott's race was even closer. And now
Andrew Gillum did not take that loss well.
Yeah.
For the record.
Well, we all have our own ways of grieving, Billy.
What a meth.
Yeah.
So what are the takeaways though? You got to speak to Manny Diaz Sr., who is the chair for the last couple of years and still somehow of the Florida Democrats.
You're a big fan.
Yeah, I've said repeatedly that Manny Diaz Sr. did to the Florida Democrats what Manny Diaz Jr. did to the Miami Hurricanes. And if ever I needed to be proven right, the national championship this week certainly proved it. No?
What national champ? Oh, you're talking
the election, the midterm elections. It's a metaphor. It's a metaphor.
I just hate when you do that.
Well, look, it's certainly part of the problem is that the Florida Democratic Party is in shambles, right? It really is the kind of dumpster fire of state parties. And, I told stories in there about how, my mom in 2018 tried to volunteer and she called the party and couldn't get anybody to call her back. Although, of course, now they're always sending her fundraising texts.
But you say it's in shambles, but it was in shambles. People have been sounding the alarm. People have been saying this thing is a mess for at least as long as, 4 years ago, 2018. So what does Manny Diaz have to say for himself?
Yeah, well, I do think there was, like I mentioned, in 2018, all the Democratic groups around the country poured in $60 million to Florida Democrats, and they almost won, right? And I think it was kind of depressing, not to donors, to volunteers, probably to voters too. And this year they only got $1 million in those out-of-state donations. Wow. And you can imagine how, people who come out every year thinking this is going to be different in this incredible swing state, where every year it comes down to 1%, and finally they were like, screw it. You also do have a lot of these, it has become this kind of MAGA magnet, and we'll see the numbers, but there are an awful lot of people from Michigan and Ohio, and even the sort of more MAGA parts of New York and Massachusetts who have moved down here to the Villages, to Cape Coral. These are some of the fastest growing metropolitan areas in the country, and they are full of right-wing boomers.
Florida's always had a transient population, a lack of institutional memory. It's where the media really fails, particularly locally, to be the institutional memory that we need. Not that anybody listens to the media anyway. You have a quote from your article in The Atlantic, Michael. Did the money dry up because the situation was hopeless, or did the situation become hopeless because the money dried up? Definitely a chicken or the egg issue there. And you have a lot of conversation about the Democrats in Florida as a losing brand, as a losing team, and people becoming frustrated with that. And to do another sports metaphor, much to Dan's chagrin.
No.
Florida and Miami are known for having fair weather fans. And when the teams are winning, people show up to the games. And when they're not, they don't. And can we look at the turnout numbers in the state of Florida for this midterm election with everything at stake? Overall, Republicans had a 66.83% turnout. Democrats a 51.97% turnout. And despite the fact that Republicans have gone from having a 300,000 deficit of registered voters in the state to a 300 they are now have 300,000 more approximately registered voters than the Democrats do. An extraordinary swing in registration, a part of the failure again of the state Democratic Party. That margin is extraordinary. I mean, and a lot of the margins in the races almost fall within there, right, Michael? I mean, within it's all, at the risk of stating the obvious, it's all about turnout, and the Democrats just didn't show up.
I don't know. When you lose by 20 points, I mean, I think it's at that point, it's not necessarily did the restaurant have bad advertising? Were the menus confusing? I think people didn't like the food, and I do think, I mentioned this actually when I wrote about the attraction of Cape Coral, this boomtown that shouldn't exist. I think some of us might not like it, and it's extremely irresponsible message that you hear from Ron DeSantis and Trump and the Republican Party down here. But there's this notion that you can come down here, you don't have to pay taxes. We're not going to tell you to get vaccinated. We're not going to tell you you can't live in a vulnerable area. We're not going to tell you you can't water your lawn when the state's having a drought. We're just not going to tell you what to do and how to do it. And, we're going to call it the free state of Florida. And then if something bad happens, we'll go to the feds and they can bail us out. It's not a good message, but it's a very attractive and alluring message. And, this is, as Dan said, this has been it's always been a kind of now more mind state. And human beings have a kind of short-term outlook on things. I do think that Democrats are going to have to come up with something that's better than broccoli to combat this ice cream. Maybe maybe there's some way to convince people that ice cream will make you fat, that it's going to cause insurance crises and water crises and climate crises, and there really will be consequences. And maybe you can come up with your own kind of ice cream, but just sitting around and complaining about it doesn't seem to be working.
How much of this election was decided by the new redistricting maps that DeSantis drew up?
Well, I think you have to say none of it at the larger level, because however you rejiggered the voters within Florida, DeSantis won statewide by 20%, and so did every other cabinet officer. So did Rubio. So like statewide, this was a Republican electorate. Now, granted, in districts like mine, where, for instance, Maria Salazar, my congresswoman, who people, she had a very close election last time, and this time she won by 15 points. She probably did benefit some from redistricting, but it's hard to, when the districts are almost all Republican, it's hard to think of a way to rearrange them in a way that Democrats will do better.
And and even all the efforts at disenfranchisement, redistricting, Proud Boys being poll watchers. You talk about the gerrymandering, the Ron DeSantis sending election police to arrest, voters who thought they were doing the right thing, and scaring people away from the polls. It doesn't explain these margins, and it doesn't explain the depressed turnout for the Democrats. But that being said, Michael, it can't just be that the food sucks. It has to be that the advertising is really good. People flock to the Olive Garden, okay? They flock to Red Lobster. They think this is Italian food and seafood, okay? And there's a lot of commercials on TV for them. So and Val Demings is not a bad candidate, okay? Annette Taddeo is not a bad candidate. Mind you, that's not true in every race, but there was obviously...
Michael made a face at Demings isn't a bad candidate.
Really? All right. Fair enough. Okay.
Well, she's a good candidate on paper. I think she was a pretty good congresswoman. She ran a terrible campaign, right? And she had plenty of money, but she did sort of nothing to give people a reason to vote for her. I do think that there... and to the extent that she was caricatured as a socialist, as a communist, as somebody who wanted to defund the police when she's an actual cop, I don't think she did a very good job of pushing back. Look, I think...
But sorry, again, go ahead. No, but I'm saying, but that doesn't mean the food is bad. That means the advertising is bad. That means the messaging is bad. Right. That means, or there wasn't enough money to get the message out or to get the vote out, right?
People didn't want to eat it, that's for sure. I mean, I think in 2020, like my state senator actually did get screwed, right? Lost by 37 votes after, Florida plunder and loot paid for, to put up a straw candidate with the same name and really did, steal the Senate seat from him. Okay, you could say like, hey, what happened? That was unfair. flash forward to 2022, where this is a swing district, a very Hispanic district, and the woman running for, to represent this swing district, that granted Biden won, but she had a get out the vote drag party, a couple days before the election. That is not reading, again, not that there's anything wrong with that, right? But that is not reading the room. And that is, I think, to the extent that Democrats have a problem, around the country, this really was a persuasion election where you saw a lot of really right-wing Republicans lose to moderate Democrats who kind of made a solid case that they could improve people's lives. In Florida, you have not seen that kind of persuasion on the Democratic side. They've been losing close elections, and they have not convinced people that they are a viable alternative.
I will tell the audience again that this man's book, if you care about Florida, the history of Florida, the swamp, I've not read anything more comprehensive about its history than this book. Can you please explain to me, Michael, why it is that Florida is so much different than the rest of the country?
Oh, gosh. Well, first of all, those are like incredibly kind words. And from such a brilliant writer as you, it really is heartwarming. And it's sort of what, writing a book sucks. And
well, the book is exceptional. I learned more reading it. I read it very quickly because of how much was in there, but you can explain better than most. Your expertise allows you to explain better than most how we got here, because you're going back all the way to when we had to cut up the marshland and make canals so that we could start destroying this place early.
Well, this has always been a place that has, attracted kind of schemers and dreamers, right? It was originally seen as wasteland. The guys who drew the maps didn't even know whether they should make it water or land. It was kind of that much of a mess. And so I do think, it's always kind of, it's been this shady place that has attracted people trying to make a quick buck, people who wanted to exploit its resources. And I do think, it is a transient place where there aren't, a lot of people who live here don't have these deep ties to Florida. They see it as a place where they can come and enjoy paradise. For some people in a kind of really rapacious way, but other people just in the sort of normal human selfishness way. But, like Bob Graham used to talk about the sort of Cincinnati syndrome, where people were born in Cincinnati, they lived their lives in Cincinnati, they made their money, they, gave to their civic institutions in Cincinnati. Then they moved to Florida, just kind of lived off this place for a few years, didn't pay any taxes, then were buried in Cincinnati. I do think this place needs more of a culture where it's so nice here, right? And yet you don't have any real industry. You don't have Fortune 500 companies moving here because it's just seen as a place to take advantage of, right? It's our industry here is bringing in more people, right? We have 1,000 new people every day, and most of them are mortgage bankers, or they lay sod or drywall, or they're real estate lawyers, but they're people whose job depends on bringing in another 1,000 people tomorrow to sort of keep the Ponzi scheme going.
Michael, and I don't know if you've gotten the memo.
Get past that.
We're a tech hub now. I don't know if you know that.
Right. We're Miami coin. We're crypto.
This is Mierda coin to the moon. Buy the dip, bro.
Arena, right? So, how's that working out?
Buy the dip, bro. Yes. Well, I mean, it's going to be Bang Brothers Arena pretty soon. I'm almost positive.
Well, that's at least a stable industry.
Absolutely. Are you kidding? That is the stablest coin of them all. Exactly. But you had mentioned that people believed anyway and went out to vote for Republican candidates because they believed that they were going to help improve their quality of life, which again is comical because, the definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over and over again and expect a different result, which in Florida has been, the Republicans have ruled this state for over 2 decades. The Democrats have been a non-entity in Florida for that entire time, have had zero control, occasionally a municipal government here or there, but by and large, not even in Miami, even in the bluest county. Most local governments down here have been run almost entirely elected, and bureaucrats have been Republicans. So that being said, no one voted for better schools. No one voted for lower taxes. Nobody voted for fewer tolls. Nobody voted for better quality of education, higher pay for teachers. Nobody voted for better health care. Nobody voted for any of these things that Florida ranks among the least, among the bottom of all the states in the union.
Didn't they in Miami
the least affordable housing market?
Didn't they vote for teachers in Miami? Not to. What was your question? Did you have a question?
Yeah, here's my question. People this election cycle in Miami-Dade voted for criminals, actual Republican criminals. Fabian Basabi, who won by just a few hundred votes, barely, in Miami Beach.
Erstwhile it boy.
Who was the male Paris Hilton. And he was caught on video just a couple of years ago in a strong arm robbery of a senior citizen, throwing her, grabbing her phone, throwing it in the water, was brought back to South Florida to run for office by the U.S. Marshals Fugitive Task Force.
What is the question?
What about your state rep, Michael?
Yeah. Well,
you elected a criminal too.
Of fraud once.
I'm sorry.
She was only convicted of fraud once.
Oh, my bad. I don't mean to be so judgmental. So you now have a Florida state rep who is convicted of fraud.
Yeah, I mean, is there a question in there, Billy?
No.
Is it why?
Vicky Lopez, Republican, ran for office. When she was in Lee County, she did what? What did she do?
Yeah, I mean, she had some fun with taxpayer dollars, some steak dinners, bought some office furniture from her family. I think, if your question is why, why do we keep bringing in the scammers
and electing them?
Yeah, look, I mean, my shtick ever since the swamp, which so you know this, Dan, is look, this is an unsustainable paradise. I keep banging my spoon on my high chair about that, right? Unsustainable. And it is. Look, I hope people have listened a little bit. Obviously, they haven't voted that way. But I also have to keep reminding people, it's paradise, right? And most of the time, we're not in the track of a Category 4 hurricane, right? Most of the time, it's nice here, and then when we are, the feds bail us out. And even Ron DeSantis did all these irresponsible budget things, and the American Rescue Plan helped fill his budget gap. So then he's able to give more money to teachers, and people think he's doing great. So I do think this kind of ice cream politics, this free lunch politics, where we're not going to add, it's all goodies and no responsibilities, no consequences. People kind of like it. I don't like it because, I try to be responsible and I try to think about public policy in the big picture. But I think, unfortunately, until this unsustainable Ponzi scheme actually collapses, it's going to look like a lot of fun. And, Billy and I, we've both talked about this concept of Florida as a place where lies have come true, right? It's like, oh, I got some swampland I can sell you. Someday there are going to be 8 million people living here, and the suckers buy and the hucksters get rich. But it turned out that the suckers and the hucksters were right. 8 million people did move here. And so I think I try not to get, too much on my high horse about people who keep eating the ice cream, because ice cream is delicious. It just you
guys, honestly, the two of you have only made me hungry these 20 minutes talking about food the entire time. Michael, thank you for being on with us. We appreciate it.
I really appreciate it, Dan. Thanks so much for your kind words.
I will say it one more time because Billy recommended very strongly the book, The Swamp, and it did not disappoint. Thanks to Michael Grunwald for his expertise there. We segue from that into a story we've been talking about a while around here, which is voting atrocities and voting criminalities that aren't criminalities, because Florida is beyond bleeped up. Adam K. Goodman, a criminal defense attorney, joins us next. Joined now by Adam Goodman. He's a criminal defense attorney, a former Miami prosecutor. Billy, tell us the story of Nathanial Singleton, who Adam is representing here, before we get to what it is that's happened specifically with Singleton. And we've talked before about some of what's happened in Florida where felons feel like they've been manipulated or coerced into voting, and then they get in trouble for voting. Explain to people the story of Nathanial Singleton.
Yeah, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis had that big press conference where he said, we've cracked down on all this voter fraud. In fact, I have this whole elections police that I put together to crack down on this. And all they actually did was find a bunch of felons who, by an act of the Florida electorate, over nearly 65% of Florida voters voted to amend our state constitution to allow felons to have a pathway back to a restoration of rights, particularly their voting rights. And so the state legislature attempted to disenfranchise Florida voters who wanted to re-enfranchise disenfranchised Florida voters by making that a little bit more difficult. And then they ran this whole kind of sting where they said that Florida voters who had, in good faith, believed that they were eligible to re-register to vote, did so, were approved by their county, were approved by the state, went to vote, and then got arrested for going to do what they thought was legally vote. Nathanial Singleton is one of those about approximately 20 Floridians who went out to vote. He was a convicted felon, but he was not eligible to vote because he had a second-degree murder conviction for which he served his time and was released. But somehow, Adam is his criminal defense attorney, somehow Nathanial was compelled or convinced that he was eligible to register to vote. Is that right, Adam?
That's correct.
So what were the circumstances of that?
So without getting into the ins and outs of what happens inside of the jail or the prison, essentially he was told by a prison release program, you could vote. You're allowed to vote. So he did his sentence. He did his time. I believe it was, the gain time was different back then, but he had an 18-year sentence followed by some probation. His sentence was complete. He registered to vote. And the division, he went to, I believe the supervisor of elections, actually, he went in to fill out his paperwork to register. And when you do that, there's a box on the form that you have to check if you are a felon. He checked that. Obviously, the person at the front desk isn't going to know any better at that point, but it's then shipped off to the parties that be to make sure and review. And ultimately, he was issued a voter registration card by Broward County.
And so when you say the powers that be, this was shipped off to the state, who knew because he admitted on the form that he was a felon. And so theoretically, it's the state's responsibility at that point to say, like, okay, is this guy a felon who is eligible under the new law, or is he ineligible? And he was determined, obviously, to be eligible and got a voter registration card, right?
Yeah, and it's pretty interesting because if you look at the bill, I mean, you didn't talk about it yet, but how Governor DeSantis amended what the voters found in with the 65% saying that felons could vote. There's actually a note in the statute, I think it's 98.075 subsection 5, which basically shows what the process is. It says that they register and it gets sent out to a committee that makes sure to review. So if there's anything that they want to look at, and you would think the first thing that they're going to look at is that box of, are you a felon? Well, they don't have a big job. Just check that, that one box is the one you have to check, and they could go do their research and see. So I can't answer what things fell through the cracks and whatnot, but it seems like that's a common thing that.
Right, because it fell through the cracks on all of these people who were arrested. All of them went and registered they all registered to vote. And
for the record, this is a 77-year-old man, and there are consequences to this because he is a convicted felon. This is also a third-degree felony, right? So we're looking at further punishment for him trying to vote that is up to 5 years in more prison penalty?
So the interesting part about it is on most standard criminal cases, when the case comes in, no matter what it is, no matter how guilty or innocent or whatever you think of the case, you always ask, what's the offer? What are you offering to resolve this matter? Because some people don't want to fight a case and some people want to take it all the way. And I've yet to get an offer on this case. So not saying that's something that we're entertaining, but presumably for every charge that he's facing four charges. He's facing up to 20 years in Florida State Prison. And
Jesus.
For a 77-year-old man, albeit he's in better shape than me at 41, that's the rest of his life basically for voting.
And he was out, was a free man. Was he working? Was he a contributing member of society, a taxpayer?
Yes. I mean, he works at a factory. He works a very blue collar job. He contributes. He's educated about the candidates, and he's what you would want as a voter, someone who is educated versus, some of these elections are, what did I saw a meme online that was, you get a new puppy versus lifetime diarrhea, and it's 50 to 49.9%. People just vote whatever.
In your experience now, as defending one of these people who were arrested by this elections squad, if you will, the state really, the legislature and the governor kind of, again, we wanted felons to have the opportunity to restore their rights. Certain felons, people convicted of certain levels of crime, if you will. But the legislature made it a lot harder, right, to resolve your case or whatever the definition is of how you become eligible. It's really hard to get there, right? Even if Nathaniel was eligible, it would be very difficult for him to figure out what to do, right, and how to pay restitution.
Yeah, I think, it's going to be difficult for anybody because, and what's interesting is that this 65% of Florida voters passed this law. I can't remember anything in my lifetime where we had 65% of people agree on anything. And immediately the next year, Governor DeSantis says, oh, no, let's change this. Let's make this more difficult. There was a lot of fighting back and forth if it was self-executing, that once the new year started, it was automatic. But they made it where you have to pay restitution, you have to pay fines, anything that's in your case. So if you had a drug case, for example, and you had a $250,000 fine, they wouldn't allow you to restore your voting rights until you pay the $250,000 fine. And most people who are convicted felons, it's kind of a rough go to go out and get a job, and then you have to get your life back in order, pay all your bills, to start saving that money to just pay it back to the government. It's kind of difficult. And then to find out the answer to how much you owe, you got to go to the clerk's office. And some of these cases, such as Mr. Singleton's cases from the 90s or 80s, and the paperwork's just not there. So it's very difficult to get an exact number of what you owe. So yeah, it's definitely difficult.
And the state has no obligation, apparently, according to litigation, to even let people know. And Dan, this is very common in the free state of Florida. I don't know if you know this. The voters vote on something, and then our elected officials will go and basically tear it to pieces.
Do whatever they want.
And do whatever they want, regardless of what it is. Even though the vast majority of Florida voters would have said, we're going to amend our state constitution to legalize medical marijuana, to reinstate felons' rights. The people of Key West who said, we don't want cruise ships anymore, coming in into the port here in our town. And then up in Tallahassee, the lawmakers go, fuck y'all, basically. Last couple things, Adam. These very public arrests of these felonious voters. What do you think the motive was behind that? Obviously, you look at the depressed voter turnout, particularly of the Democratic Party in this week's midterm, and you look at all the efforts on the part of this legislature and this administration to depress that turnout. Certainly scaring people into thinking you might get arrested if you show up to vote is a disincentive to show up and vote. But what do you think the motives were behind Nathaniel and these other 20 Floridians' arrests?
So I think it's kind of what you said. It's definitely a motive to scare people into not exercising their right to vote. I think it's a stunt. I think there's no reason to have a big press conference if, other than, hey, look at me. I think that what we're going to be seeing is, and I'm no political science or political expert, but I think what we're going to be seeing is DeSantis is running for governor in 2 years. And this is just something that people see on TV. It's a bright, shiny thing that some people could gravitate to.
President, you meant, right? President.
Yes, I was in Ireland over the summer, and people were asking. You talk to people, and someone's like, "Oh, I'm from California. I love your governor," and I started bringing up some of the judges he's appointed, such as that there's been issues with. There are other things that he comes up. These aren't things that the average American sees. So they're going to see a president who's cracking down on voter fraud. And what was interesting, I thought I was looking at this last night, is for the 20 arrests that he made, I think I wrote down the number, it costs the taxpayers about $126,000 per arrest of each of these 20 people, because they have about 45 investigators in this new election fraud department he created. So for $126,000 a year, which I don't know what these investigators are doing when it's not election time, these people are investigating fraud when that $126,000 could possibly go to, 2 more prosecutors per year in a county, or an extra homicide detective in Miami-Dade County. We're not focusing on, really helping Floridians. We're focusing on, let's get this out to the public so they see when I run for president, look at what I'm tough on.
Adam, last question. We're breaking some news here, Dan, on the Because Miami podcast. Pretty extraordinary kind of postscript or epilogue to this story.
Late in the show to be breaking news. You would think we would have done it earlier if it was big, important breaking news.
One would think that we bury the lead a bit.
I mean, we're damn near 40 to 50 minutes into this, and now you've decided to break the news. What is the breaking news?
So Nathanial Singleton, 77-year-old man, convicted felon, is told he's eligible to register to vote. He does so. He gets a voter registration card from the state of Florida and the county of Broward, and then gets arrested for going out and voting. Adam, what happened between the time he was arrested and the time of this week's midterm election?
So what's interesting is that, and I love to break news, but Mr. Singleton got another voter registration card in the mail without registering to vote. So it looks as if he got from Broward back in, he was issued on October 4th, 2022, another voter registration card from Broward County, which says on the front of the card that it's re-precincting.
Right.
So we had talked about, sometimes they just send out new cards. So someone somewhere decided that, let's send them another card. And
there was redistricting in his district. And so a man who was arrested for voting was sent a new voter registration card from the state of Florida so that he could go out once again.
Tempting him to vote again. Tempting him to vote, yet again.
So you think maybe there'd be a flag on his account or something? Or maybe someone would say, this guy is, I mean, what they should have done the first time, their due diligence and their jobs as elections officials in the state of Florida and in Broward County. And yet, he got another voter registration.
There is a flag on the account.
Because
it's
Florida.
It's the American flag. Thank you, Adam. We appreciate your time. Thank you for the insight, sir.
Thank you. And I'm glad the election was within 20 votes, so everything worked out for the governor.
Thank you, sir. We appreciate it.
Take care.
Congratulations on the film, Billy. Everyone can get it. Hulu, God forbid, it's doing very well. People are eating it up. Thrilled for you. Any good stories to close out on the last couple of weeks of you worked very hard on God forbid. You spent more than a year on that project, and the turnout, the viewing has been exceptional. I would imagine the movie's exceptional.
And it's all over the world. It's on Disney Plus and some of the foreign markets. I mean, it's in Latin America, it's in Australia, it's in Asia, it's all over the world. Now, finally, just this week, actually, it launched internationally. So I'm looking forward to hearing the reactions from everywhere. The reactions domestic have really helped explain a lot of things. I mean, 88% of white evangelicals voted for Herschel in Georgia. I mean, go. I think he got 8% of the black vote, but 88% of the white evangelical vote. They are willing to send women to prison for getting abortions, but the men who finance them, they want to send to the United States Senate. But I will say that our last 3 documentaries, really, I was going to say the 2 of the last 3, but really the last 3 of them for people who are looking to explain what's going on in Florida. What's going on in Miami? Why is that such a unique place and seemingly an outlier against the rest of the country? I would say watch our last 3 documentaries. Watch 537 Votes on HBO. Watch Cocaine Cowboys, The Kings of Miami on Netflix. And watch God Forbid, the sex scandal that brought down a dynasty on Hulu.
All of them exceptional. Thank you, sir. We'll talk to you in a couple of weeks.
Cocaine's.